Hi, everyone. I'm Utkarsh, the founder of Network Capital, here with Roshan Paul, the co founder of Amani Institute and also an author of a book that we're about to discuss. Just want to start by giving a huge shout out to all our community members around the world. Exactly 1 year back, we were featured in NYU's report on virtual communities making a difference in the world. And we're a hybrid community focused on mentorship and careers. But the essence of all of it are people like you listening into this particular discussion and people like Roshan who've built their category of one, building and scaling social ventures and writing about it. So, welcome to Network Capital, Roshan. How are you today?
Thanks so much for having me, Utkarsh. It's a pleasure after following Network Capital for a while. I'm doing well, a little jet lagged. I just got into Bangalore for a few days from the US, but otherwise all good.
Okay, wonderful. So, tell us a bit about yourself and how did you decide to get interested in the social impact policy space? Walk us through the early days in your career.
Sure. So I grew up in a very normal middle class, family in Bangalore. Played a lot of cricket as a kid, but didn't really study too much. And because I was a little bit of a misfit in the traditional Indian education system, I was fortunate to get a chance to go study in the U.S. for undergraduate. And like most foreign students, I was looking at consulting or investment banking careers. But my final year of college coincided with 9/11, which was followed by the terrorist attack on the parliament in India, followed by the Gujarat riots, followed by the US bombing Afghanistan. And so it seemed like the two countries I knew best, India and the US, seemed to be on fire. And I was thinking, what good would I do in a traditional corporate job? Let me try and do something more socially impactful with my career. And so that's how I got started working in social entrepreneurship. So I moved back to India, turned down a potentially very high paying job, with a top ranked consulting firm, and moved back to India and started working in social entrepreneurship.
Fascinating. And what was it like coming back to India and tinkering with social impact organizations? What was your family's reaction when they heard that you've quit the high-paying job in consulting and you're trying to build something new?
Yeah, actually, I didn't even quit it. I turned it down even before I started, and it was a recession year, 2002. So everyone thought I was nuts, not for the first time, not for the last either. So my family though is pretty. I would say not the norm. My dad started one of India's first management consulting firms when India was a socialist country. Everyone thought he was crazy. And so I think they always told me, go out and do what makes you happy. As long as you can take care of yourself, we will support you. So I was fortunate to have that kind of support. So my parents
Hmm.
always kind of supported me in these choices, which I know is not always the case for people. But when I came back, I moved up to New Delhi and started working at very low salary for an NGO. And it was a great learning experience,
Hmm.
because I learned a lot about on the ground, work in development. But at the same time, I was, of course, super privileged because I knew I could always leave that, leave that job and go back to Bangalore, and my family would, take care of me. So I was very conscious of being privileged to do that, and therefore tried to live within my means. So I tried to not spend more money than the small amount of money that I was making, and try to supplement my income with different things. Of course, this was back in 2003, and the world has changed a lot since then, particularly the world of social impact. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But it was a great formative learning experience as well.
Yeah. So, how did you decide to set up Amani? What was the thought process? And tell us about the first 100 days.
Sure. So, as I said, people thought I was crazy at 22 when I turned down, a job in the US and moved back to India to work for an NGO. But I, built a career working in social entrepreneurship. And 10 years into that, I was with a very well-known nonprofit organization called Ashoka, working out of their headquarters in Washington, D.C., traveling around the world for my work, giving talks at, like Harvard University, Georgetown, the World Bank, and so on. And those same people who thought I was crazy were starting to call me up and say, "Hey, the social impact thing, how do you do it? Like, I want to build a career like this too. It seems like there's meaning, but also like you're getting to live a pretty cool life." And that's when I realized that more and more people were starting to get interested in this, but they didn't know how to get into this field. And simultaneously, I knew that even though I was lucky to have a world-class education, one of the best educations you could probably get, I learned so much more while working than I ever did in school, in the classroom.
Hmm.
And I felt like if that was the case with the world's best universities, what's it like everywhere else? And we needed a different way of training people for careers in social change. And there didn't seem to be that kind of training out there at the time. And so, putting those two things together, I also met a woman from Argentina who had a very different background than me. She grew up as a refugee, but had come to similar conclusions. And so we decided to join forces. So we both worked at Ashoka in Washington, D.C. So we quit our jobs. And for the second time, people thought I was nuts. I turned down a green card track job in the
Hmm.
US to move to Africa to start an NGO. So moved to Nairobi, Kenya, along with my co-founder, and we started Amani Institute there. The first 100 days a little bit of a misnomer because I was working on it for like 2 years, doing all the feasibility work and the research and the concept work. But I would say when we moved to Africa was probably when we think of it as when we got started. And the
Right.
first 100 days was really, well, one really big thing happened that I think is an interesting lesson. Um, when we moved to Africa, we moved with a contract, with a partnership with a major US university in our pocket. And that was what gave us the confidence to say, all right, we're going to try this out. We're going to go and create an alternative education program. About a month and a half or 2 months after landing in Kenya and starting to build out everything, the university pulled out of the deal. And so we now had moved our lives to Africa, and now we were without our first client or our first partner. And our board, of directors was like, hey, this is not going to work. You need to find another university partner and so on. But we had talked to so many universities by this point that we knew it was going to take forever. And then one friend said, something really wise. He said, actually trying to partner with the university, while it might seem to be the strategic way to do it, is actually the highest risk approach you can take because the universities are notoriously flaky. And so that's when we decided to try create our own independent standalone entity. And so we'd actually live or die on our own merits and not,
Hmm.
on the whims and fancies of like a large corporate partner. And so I think that choice to then go it alone was a really fundamental choice at that point, and that was probably the biggest thing that happened in those first 100 days.
Yeah. So, what was the difference between what you went to Africa with and what you ended up doing after first 100 days? Because it seems like you were about to pivot, and that would go on to define a big chunk of your
Mhm.
life and your experiences.
Yeah, so rather than creating a exchange program for universities that was going to be different than other programs, but nevertheless still through universities and university students, we ended up creating an independent master's equivalent kind of fellowship program that was going to be open to not just students from universities, but anyone of any age from anywhere in the world, as long as they were willing to come to Nairobi for 5 months and do our program, which consisted of an internship, classwork with some of the most like leading people in the sector, and a lot of focus on personal growth, innovation, skill building, and so on. And so that was the first class of fellows that we launched in 2013. We had 13 or 14 brave people
Hmm.
from like 10 different countries who took a chance
Yeah.
on this crazy Indian and Argentinian setting up a program in Africa. But then it grew from there. And, today we've had more than 600 people from 70 something countries, have gone through the program in 3 different continents, actually, because we then expanded it to Brazil and then to India as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see the emergence of new kinds of education institutes. We on Network Capital run a wide range of cohort-based courses, but we
Hmm.
noticed that Amani has been doing something very similar, but in a different sector for a lot longer.
Hmm.
So kudos to all of you for being, one of the first people to try and experiment with the education system. It's
Thank
fascinating.
you.
I study this carefully, and I'm constantly motivated by new forms of education that are emerging.
Hmm.
So once there was some momentum, some traction, you had 14 adventurous souls fly to Nairobi and start their
Hmm.
career. What do you think changed in the society or societal mindset that enabled all of these people to make these leaps of faith?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think we intuited that something was changing in society, and I think a lot of it started off with the 2008 recession, the global recession, because I think it made a lot of people think, what's the point of like trying to build a stable, secure job if like these 100-year-old banks can go out of business overnight, or entire
Yeah,
countries' economies can collapse? Like, why am I sitting in a cubicle just trying to build my bank account? I want to do something more meaningful with my life. So you started to see enrollment in entrepreneurship programs in universities went through the roof. People were quitting corporate jobs everywhere, and looking to do something that was more in line with their values. And we started to see this but not even until we had moved to Kenya. And started the program, and we started to see the people coming into that program. We initially designed for your 23 to 25-year-old young college graduate looking to build their career in social change. But our first class, the average age was 30. And our first prototype that we ran, the average age was closer to 40. And we
nice.
realized that there was a movement of people that were quitting corporate jobs, looking to change their career into social impact. And I think, since then it's just grown. It's been a big wave of change on this. I give millennials a lot of credit for that, and I think Gen Z is following in their footsteps. And that's really inspiring, even my generation and older ones to think and rethink about what the meaning of work is all about, what the purpose of one's career should be, and people increasingly not willing to choose between making a living and making a difference, and they want to have both.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what led to the rise of and the growth of Amani Institute and lots of other like-minded educational
Hmm.
institutions as well.
For sure, there has been a clear mindset shift. It's happening right now. It happened a decade back, and usually it's a series of events that lead up to it,
Hmm.
right? But it's not a straightforward process. Did you notice something about, say, the marital status of people who enrolled in your early programs? Did you notice that people were coming in once they had a certain amount of income or a bank balance, or perhaps they paid off their education loans? Could you give us a color about the cohorts of Amani over the years and how it's evolved?
Sure. So we typically had, I would say, 2 to 3 different kinds of people. We had young people looking early on in their careers. We had mid-career people who, let's say, like 27, 28 to 45, who had been working for a while and wanted to make that shift to social change. And then we had also, I think, um, people who are already working in social impact, for like 5 to 10 to 15 years, and wanted to switch within the industry, within the sector to, let's say they were working in education, they wanted to switch to healthcare, they wanted to switch to renewable energy or something like that, and they were using our program to make that change. Because we were inviting people to come to Africa to study, or to come to Brazil to study, people tended to be unmarried, or certainly if they were married, they didn't have kids. It was
Hmm.
rare to have a traveling student with a family, but of course we had local students in Kenya and Brazil and India that had families, had kids
Hmm.
as well, and they were able to do the program, but they didn't have to relocate to another continent for 5 months. So that was kind of a factor, like that we weren't able to be as diverse or inclusive as we
Hmm.
would like in terms of people's life situations. But of course, we were
Hmm.
very inclusive in terms of geography, because
Yeah.
people really came from around the world for this.
How did the curriculum evolve over the time you were there?
It actually didn't evolve too much. Like we put a lot of work into setting it up, lots of research, lots of talking to leaders and mentors, and developed it. And then we tweaked it and we changed the length of the program and we changed, the requirements to graduate and like things like that. But the building blocks of, the focus on building practical skills that employers demand, on building on the core skill there being innovation and creativity, as the number one super skill that we believe that everyone should have in a rapidly changing world. The focus on personal development, personal growth, understanding who you are, what your motivations are. Those things, the internship element, to get real life experience in problem solving and change making. Those things actually didn't change at all until COVID. But
Yeah.
even then we tried to keep all of that, but then it started to look slightly different as we moved the program online. But actually, for those first, 7 to 8 years, it didn't change very much at all. Of course, the topics
Hmm.
changed and some faculty changed and so on, but the core of it, didn't change very much.
Yeah. Tell us about the pricing, the business model, and the outcomes that you promised. Usually, we observe that in cohort-based courses, in person or online, people usually pay for an outcome or a series of outcomes. And a
Yeah.
secondary benefit, I think, is being part of the community.
Hmm.
But I'm curious to learn from your example. What did you observe and how did you approach it?
I think like with a lot of organizations like ours, or a lot of programs, even traditional university programs, in many ways, people sign up for the credential and the
Hmm.
knowledge,
Yeah.
but what they end up leaving with is personal growth and community, or a global network, right? And it's very hard to get people to pay in advance for personal growth and a community. So they pay for the credential and the skills, but what they take out of it, is something else, or what they most value from it. And that was the case with all of the fellowships I've ever done. It's the case with how a lot of people describe their master's programs, and in our case, it was no different as well. People came to us because they thought it was a career development, career, like a
Hmm.
way to switch their career, and it is. But what they most valued coming out of it was that deep focus on who they are as a person and being part of a global community of change makers. The people who don't look at them and say, yeah, why do you want to go do that? That sounds crazy,
Hmm.
right? Like it's a bit lonely sometimes in your family circles or in your alumni circles of your high schools and so on, when people don't understand why you want to go study in Africa or why do you want to go work for an NGO or a social business. So when you're around other people who are making the same life choices and who don't think you're odd or crazy for doing that, then that's tremendously empowering and liberating as well. And I think that that's what gives people, a lot of value that they take from such programs.
Understood. So, Roshan, it seems like career transition is something that you've either facilitated, you've gone through many career transitions as well. Maybe you want to tell us a bit about your career transitions that you've taken, maybe more recently, and what was the guiding factor.
Sure. So last year, after 10 years at the helm of Amani Institute, I decided to step down as CEO and do something else. And there were many reasons for this, but I think if I was to sum it up, I would say 10 years at the helm of anything is a long time. There's an epidemic, I would say, of founder syndrome in social impact organizations, particularly social enterprises. And we just thought that it was important to turn it over to different leadership, to new leadership, to take the organization in different, directions, and for us to then be freed up to pursue other interests as well. And so that's what we decided to do. And both my co-founder and I stepped down. And I've ended up, I was living in India at the time, and then have subsequently, moved to the US. And now I'm, freelancing, and trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, as I say.
One of the most popular fellowships on Network Capital, our cohort-based course, is called I Don't Know What I Want to Do with My Life Fellowship.
Hmm.
And it can happen to somebody who has, decades of experience like you, And it can
Hmm.
happen to somebody out of college. There's no date by which you figure everything out. Do you agree with that
Absolutely.
broadly?
100%. I would say even sometimes the most interesting people are the people who in their 40s and 50s haven't yet figured it all out, or
Yeah.
are willing to walk away from, an existing role in society and try something completely different. I'm always more interested in those stories than the people who do the same thing for, 50 years.
Yeah. Have you heard this song called Sunscreen?
Yeah.
So there's a
Baz
line in
Luhrmann.
that.
Yeah.
That is right. Yeah. Some
Yeah.
of the most interesting 40-year-olds
Yeah.
still don't know what they're doing with their life. So yeah, that's
Exactly.
really interesting, Roshan.
Hmm.
Um, were you nervous making this transition? Did you have a clear path ready? And was the book already in the works when you quit?
Yeah, the book was in the works as kind of our gift to the world, with as we were stepping down from Amani Institute, like an attempt to distill everything we'd learned in a decade of, helping thousands of people from around the world move into social change careers. It's like, what did we learn from that, and how can we put that out into something that would be easily accessible and digestible by people anywhere in the world? So the book was, a way to do that. I didn't have a clear path. I didn't know what I wanted to do. In fact, I decided to take a sabbatical. So I
Hmm.
spent counterintuitively, unlike most people, I decided to travel during the pandemic. And so I spent 8 months with my wife on the road with only carry-on bags, going to remote islands and rainforests, and just taking some time off and not thinking about what I wanted to do next. And so I took about 8 months off, and then came back to um, try to figure out what was going to happen next. We moved to the US, and I decided to do some freelancing work for a while.
All right. And how's that going now that you're perhaps employed by the internet? You're teaching on
Yeah,
the internet, writing on the internet, selling on the internet. How's that going for you?
it's going well. I'm working on a few different projects with several social impact organizations, foundations, and some social enterprises. I'm doing a lot of talks like this to share about the book, and to help more and more people find their way to it. Yeah, starting to see that I want to try to spend the next decade of my career in supporting, or helping to battle the climate crisis. And so, that's the area that I'm most looking at right now. Of course, I'm open to things evolving. Life rarely goes according to one's plans. It's something that I've learned. But for now, I'm looking at climate change as kind of the thing I want to dedicate the next phase of my life to. And so I'm working on a couple of projects related to that as I try to figure out how to make my best contribution in this space.
Talk to me about career regret and one highlight or an experience or a moment that really was the opposite of regret, something that you're proud of and you really thought it was a meaningful contribution to the world.
Um, I can't say that there's a really strong regret at a career level. Um, Everything's I think with a long enough span of time, everything you make lemonade out of your lemons, right? And I don't believe necessarily that everything happens for the best, as some people say, but I do think that you can make the best out of a situation. So, of course, there were risks, turning down a well-paid job to move into social impact. When I was going to start Amani Institute, actually, I was doing some work in my previous job with the World Bank, and the World Bank
Hmm.
offered me again an opportunity to come work with them. It would have probably doubled my salary that I was making at the time. I had lots of loans from my masters to pay off, and I seriously considered it. But I knew that that was a unique moment in my life that I had the ability, the freedom to go start a new organization, and if I didn't do it then, I might always regret it. So I think I was able to project that I would regret it, and then acted accordingly. So I
Hmm.
can't say like that there's a regret like that. Oh well, perhaps the one, it's a relatively minor regret, but I spent some time before I went to my master's. I spent some time traveling in the northeast of India, and I wrote a series of articles for a magazine about that. And then I enrolled at Harvard for my master's, and I got an email from a major publisher in India saying, we've been reading articles, we really liked it. Would you like to, go write a book and we'll publish it? But I had just moved to the US again. I was, just started at Harvard, and I kind of like felt that I should finish my master's. And so I turned that opportunity down. And that's maybe something I regret. In hindsight, knowing what I know now, I really should have taken a leave of absence, and, gone and written that book about the Northeast. But, that's probably one. A career highlight is also writing related. So my internships in college were cricket journalism, and in 2001, the Australian cricket team was coming to India. Turned out to be a very famous a series. And I was invited by my employer, was a news portal, to drop out of college and become a cricket journalist and cover this tour. And I just felt that while I would have so much fun doing that, it wouldn't give me the fulfillment that I was seeking in the long term. And so I turned that down and went on to complete university, and then moved into a social impact career, as I talked about. And that's one thing that was a career highlight. It was a really good decision because, I'm sure I would have enjoyed being a cricket journalist, but I think, life has panned out really interestingly otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. Um, let's turn to writing because it seems
Mhm.
to have been an interest of yours, perhaps a passion, even maybe love, who knows. Talk to us about the new book. You told us that it was, in a way, sharing the big lessons from, venturing into
Mhm.
this space. How did you structure the book, and how would you measure the success of the book?
So to measure the success of it, we want to help as many people as possible move into careers that are both meaningful to them and impactful to the world. So we are hoping to get this book out to as many people as possible. Universities being one major target audience, but career shifters, people who are questioning and examining their careers through platforms like Network Capital, and others that we're talking with and speaking to. So we're trying to reach as many people as possible with that, or creating courses, creating other kinds of ways of disseminating the knowledge from the book. And how did we structure the book? So we narrowed down kind of six key principles that we call six keys to unlock your career and social impact. And for each of those principles or keys, we shared stories of people who are living up to them. We broke it down into frameworks and tools that anyone can apply right away. We shared our own stories of trying to live according to these principles as well. But before we went into the keys, we also wrote about the evolution of the social impact landscape. I
Hmm.
think for perhaps many people watching this, and certainly like I would say the mainstream of society, doesn't know that social impact or the opportunities in social impact have never been greater than they are today. There is a default mindset, particularly in our parents' generation, that working in social impact means that you're going to work for an NGO or a local nonprofit, maybe not make a lot of money, and they don't realize that this field has exploded in the last 20 or 30 years, and there's opportunities with big companies, there's opportunities with consulting firms, with research firms, with social businesses, social enterprises. While the NGO landscape has also grown and become more professional, and so on, we've had impact, a whole new class of investors and finance professionals entering the space. So most people just aren't aware of that. And so
Right.
in the first part of the book, we actually lay out this full landscape, and we help people then, we ask a series of questions so that we invite people to ask themselves a series of questions that will help them choose based on their life stage, based on their interests, based on their education, which which of these types of organizations is the best fit for them. And then armed with that knowledge, we then go into 6 principles that they can use to, build their career over the long haul as well. So that's how we decided to structure it.
Tell me how has this sector exploded? Why are the opportunities differently paid, and perhaps bigger than they were a decade or two back?
I think the main reason is kind of what I was saying, is that the demand or the supply of people trying to come into this field has been increasing over the last 2 decades. I think particularly internationally, since the global recession, I think in the Western world, 9/11 was a big turning point for not just for me, but for lots of people. And I think that supply of people, the forced organizations to get a lot more conscious of their role in society. It also led to lots of new, entrepreneurs setting up new organizations, growing new organizations. So on the one hand, I think we saw a lot more entrepreneurs. We saw a lot more focus on business approaches to making social change that is certainly much more a product of the 21st century than the 20th or the 19th centuries. And we saw, therefore, the investors and and investors coming in to support that. And then the really interesting thing that happened was, once more and more organizations came up and started to grow, a new class of organizations that we call, in the book, we call intermediaries, right? So these are organizations that are themselves not working with disadvantaged populations, but are supporting the organizations working with disadvantaged populations. So your training and capacity building institutes, your consulting firms, and every major a private sector consulting firm today has a social impact practice, right? So your consulting firms, research firms, ecosystem builders, that whole sector exploded. Those organizations tend to pay well. They tend to have really interesting career opportunities, international travel, things like that. And so it was very attractive to a lot of people to feel like they could both make a good living, travel around the world, but also do meaningful work as well. And so I think the brand of working in social change has improved a lot, I would say, in the last
Yeah.
20 years than the 20th century. Before it, where it was more, I would say, people deeply passionate about causes and issues. And today it's like seen as a professional endeavor like anything else that you
Yeah.
can do.
And you talked about long-term thinking. Long-term thinking in any sector is hard, in any context is hard. But in the social sector, it has been perhaps even harder than other spaces. Can you tell
Mhm.
us why, and what's your solution, or what's something that you propose in the book?
I think within the book we talk about how social change is not an overnight thing.
Hmm.
Particularly I think in recent times, with Silicon Valley getting quite into social impact, there's this idea that, like, a new app or a new platform is going to solve a social problem.
Yeah.
And that's almost never the case, right? Social change takes decades, it takes centuries. Like problems like poverty and hunger, and healthcare or disease have been with us since the start of humanity, right? They're not going to go away overnight. So you've got to realize that this is not a 2-year or a 3-year, stint, and you'll magically, end global hunger or something. Like, it's a career, and there'll be people after you that's going to
Hmm.
come in and build on what you've done just as much as you've been building on what people did before you. So I think that's actually really liberating, right? It takes off the pressure that you've got to solve a problem once and for all, and say that you can make your best contribution to solving a problem, and that it's going
Hmm.
to take a career to do that. And once you think that, you realize that, the metaphor we use in the book is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so, you prepare for a marathon differently, you train for a marathon differently, and you pace yourself. You don't run flat out the whole time. So We talk about different things you can do along the way
Hmm.
through your career to make sure that you're not burning out, you're not getting prematurely cynical. You're taking care of your short-term needs as well as your long-term needs. Because if it's like that famous analogy of like putting on your own oxygen mask first before helping others that we always talk, here in airplanes. You've got to, take care of yourself through this work, because otherwise you're not going to be any good to anybody, right? The reason we don't put on someone else's oxygen mask first is that then we'll be unconscious and can't put on our own, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to put your own oxygen mask on first, and I think the same thing is true if you think about your career in the long term as well. So that's
Yeah.
how we talk about it in the book as well. I think it's really important to take care of your short-term needs, but also always focus on what that long-term mission, that long-term purpose that you're striving towards is as well.
That's really well said. I think it'll resonate with a lot of people who are looking to build a career in the sector. How did you edit this book, and what were some of the parts that you wish you could include, but perhaps space didn't allow, perhaps other reasons prevented you?
Gosh, so many things. We have so many stories of our alumni, of our peers, many, many different concepts that we wish we could have included. For instance, there's one, based on your last question about the short term vis-a-vis the long term. One of my favorite concepts is this idea of the three horizons, and that is something we didn't include in the book just from a space standpoint. We wanted the book to not be too big. We wanted people to feel like they could read it in a weekend, and be able to digest it and apply it. So we did keep it relatively short. It's about 200 and 20 pages or something like that, and it's written as a conversation. The whole book is written as a conversation between my co-founder and me, and two individuals who are fictional characters but represent the audience, that we want to read the
Hmm.
book. So it's a non-fiction book, but with fictional characters. One is a young man who has come out of university and is burning to do something around climate change but doesn't know how. And the other is a woman who's been about 15 years into her career, has a family, has been working as a designer in an industrial company, and wants to move into social impact and is trying to figure out how to bring her particular skills into impact. And so they ask us the questions in the book that our students have been asking us for a decade, and so we use that device as a way to answer the questions that the audience will hopefully have, or that we've seen people have, to walk people through what it would be like to build a career in social change.
Yeah, phenomenal. And just like coming towards the end of this discussion,
Hmm.
do you have any thoughts about how the social sector at a very high level is going to look like, say, 10 years from now? Are there some trends that we should be paying attention to? Are there some forces, geopolitical or otherwise, that you think will become more important in deciding the trajectory that this sector takes?
For sure. Um, I think there are a few trends. I think the two most important ones are, one is the rise of right-wing governments around the world and the way that they are closing down civil society in many parts of the world. And that's making it harder for people to do the traditional nonprofit or NGO kind of work. And at the same time, what's happening is the rise of the private sector of businesses coming into the impact space. And that's being driven by their customers, it's being driven by their employees, it's been driven by larger trends or existential issues like climate change, or by in like issues of justice like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or things like the Me Too movement and so on, that are all pushing companies to be more. It's not just about making profits for your shareholders. It's really about doing something that makes a difference to the planet. And I think that I think those two things, is something that I see over the next
Hmm.
4 or 5 to 10 years is the growing role of businesses in social impact, and at the same time, ongoing struggle for traditional civil society to play the role it once did of holding, you know, governments and companies to account. Like, so the original way in which we
Hmm.
set up society was that governments did some things, companies did some things, and where there were market failures, NGOs stepped up to fill the gap between governments and companies. And I think as companies move into the NGO space, as NGOs start to get more business-like in many ways, but also as governments start to also intrude on what NGOs were doing, all of that's creating this kind of messy soup in a way, but it's also causing a lot of innovation,
Hmm.
and lots of really interesting partnerships, lots of interesting new organizational forms that are coming out. And so I think that would be a third trend, maybe, is the rise of different organizational models and
Hmm.
organization forms that are going to always blend impact with,
Hmm.
making profits, or that the purpose of business isn't anymore to make profits, but to solve problems, right? And you do business as the way in which you do that. I think that's rising, and that's going to keep rising.
Yeah. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I haven't, or is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience that we haven't touched upon in this discussion so far?
A question I get a lot is, what's one thing? How do I get started? You know,
Hmm.
and I would say that oftentimes people spend a lot of time thinking and maybe strategizing and trying to get everything in place before they get started to move towards social impact. And I think the better way to do it is to just start. Start wherever you can, whether it's on your street, whether it's in your current organization. Try to do what you can today or tomorrow to make the world a better place, or to support people who are spending their lives doing so. And then you'll work your way, into something that matters to you. I don't think you find your passion. I think you uncover your passion while you're doing other things, and you realize it was there all along. If you had told me like 2 years before I started Amani Institute that I would be starting an educational entrepreneurial adventure, I would have laughed at you. Like, I had no background in education. I'm not a teacher. I had zero background in education, and yet I ended up, starting an educational nonprofit and, giving talks on the future of education. 10 years or 5 years later, speaking at TED, at the White House, and places like that on education when I had no background in it. And so I think you discover what's important to you by virtue of just getting started and
Hmm.
doing something. And I would recommend that to everyone is don't think too much. Just start doing. There's a great line from an engineer from Google that says, "Doing is the best form of thinking," and I really believe that, and that's what I would encourage people to do.
Yeah, fascinating. And lastly, where can people go to check out your book, and how might they connect with you?
Absolutely. So the book is widely available on Amazon, anywhere in the world. It's certainly available on Kindle anywhere in the world. It's available on a lot of other ebook sites as well. The paperback or physical versions are mostly available in the West, sorry to say, and that's just a function of the publishing industry. But you can always have it shipped to you. Um, the best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn. So anyone's like, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Very happy to help as many people as possible. As we said, I believe we're going to share a link to the book in the description of this
Yes.
this program, and so feel free to check it out and get in touch.
Yeah, for sure. And we have a career restart fellowship coming up as well. And we'll have many of our fellows check out your book. Thank you very much, Roshan, and all the very best for everything that lies ahead of you.
Thank you, Utkarsh. Thank you for everything you're doing to help so many people as well move into more meaningful careers and happier lives. So, congrats on all the success and growth of Network Capital over the years, and long may it continue.